who were the Johannites of the East. This was going to be my big moment, and Steve's done it. In fact, Steve's done it all down to there, where I put the mark. The first bit of my talk. Thank you, Steve. Done very nicely. I'd like to see you in this skirt, though. But yes, okay, the Johannites of the East were quite obviously the Mandaeans or Mandeans. But I've been, like Steve, calling them Mandaeans for ages, so I probably still call them that. If you remember what Steve said, they are this Gnostic sect from Iran, Iraq, and now Catford. And the internet, they're on the internet. They are known as St. John's Christians, well, they were known as St. John's Christians to Victorian explorers. And this was because they revered John the Baptist greatly as their great prophet, as their great teacher, well, their greatest teacher in a long line of priests. They don't, and this is very important, they don't worship him as God or the Son of God or anything like that. He's their priest. And there were priests in the line that went before him and priests in the line that came after him, including women, as Steve pointed out. But being called St. John's Christians is a grave misnomer. And I have to say here that I was sitting listening to Steve talking, my heart was thudding, I was thinking, he's going to do my big finale. He's going to give my big revelation. I thought I'll throw a shoe at him or something if he does. But you didn't. No, you wouldn't, would you? No. So, better not. Anyway, why is... You would think, wouldn't you, that a group of people who revered John the Baptist so much and still do, and you know, through all their persecutions and all the attempts by proselyters from other religions to convert them, they still upheld John the Baptist. So you would think that they would be, if anything, Christians, in any sense of the word, in the usual sense of the word. But they ain't. In fact, the big revelation, which Steve didn't mention, thank you, Steve, about the Mandeans, is that they loathe and despise Jesus. Now, this is very strange, isn't it? They think John the Baptist is great. They hate Jesus. Okay, let's look at some of their words, how they describe Jesus. One of the Mandeans' holy books describes him, and you can't get much more uncompromising than this, as the lying Messiah. They also describe him, they say he perverted the words of the light and changed them to darkness, and converted those who were mine, and the mine refers to John the Baptist, and perverted all the cults. Another Mandaean holy book says, do not believe him, that's Jesus, because he practices sorcery and treachery. Well, this is quite something, isn't it, for a group that have a thing about John the Baptist, to say the least. I mean, these are the Johannites of the East, the Mandeans, the people who, as Steve pointed out, very probably at Haran in what is now southern Turkey, met the Knights Templar and passed on to them a great secret. And it was after that that the Templars became, or the inner circle of the Templars became Johannite. So quite clearly, the Mandeans' beliefs became in some measure and in some fashion the Knights Templars' belief, or the inner circle of the Knights Templar. But they also, let's just look at some other things that they call Jesus. They call him many, many times the usurper of John's following. And they also use an interesting phrase, which I want you to remember of Jesus. They call him son of a woman. Now, you might think that means absolutely nothing, because we're all sons and daughters of women. I mean, that's just a part of the human condition. But it's, in the Middle East, it still is a dire insult, because in cultures that don't value women, to be son of a woman means not only are you weak and ineffectual, but that you don't have a dad. You're illegitimate. You're a bastard. So to call somebody son of a woman is not a good idea if you want to, get by in Arab country. But they call Jesus this. It's the greatest insult they can muster. And I want you to remember that term, because it's very important later on. Right, well, leaving aside briefly for the moment the Mandaeans' utter loathing of Jesus, well, we've seen how Leonardo, Clive pointed out, Leonardo da Vinci had one of the greatest thinkers of all time, had this big thing about John the Baptist and other leaders of the underground culture particularly, which is very odd, as Clive pointed out, because why would reverence for a Christian saint, become a thing become a furtive thing, a surreptitious thing, a heretical thing? And I just want you to consider this. In all the Christian martyrs that you know of, John the Baptist is almost never included. It's as if his death, his life, his message was completely separate from Jesus' mission. And you would think, wouldn't you, that if he really were what people believe him to be, the precursor of Jesus, who was somehow, very important because he was the precursor of Jesus, that he would be the first Christian martyr. But he's not. St. Stephen's the first Christian martyr. It's very interesting, and it gets much more interesting. As John the Baptist is portrayed in the New Testament, there is nothing there to reveal why Leonardo, etc., had a big thing about him. I mean, there's very little about John the Baptist in the New Testament. And he comes over, the little that there is, as being this uncompromising John Knox puritanical figure, very unappealing certainly to modern Western tastes, who comes along out of the desert and says, "Oh, you're all evil, I'm going to baptize you." And they say, "Right." And that is, that's it really. I mean, then, of course, we know that after he falls down at Jesus' feet, as if his whole life, up to that moment, was all about waiting for Jesus. And that, of course, is what we're meant to believe when we read the New Testament. We'll come to that in a moment, but it's very interesting. It's as if also we are led to believe that his mission was exclusively, John the Baptist's mission was exclusively for the Jews in Judea. We're also led to believe that Jesus concentrated on Judea. Well, they certainly did, but there is evidence, which unfortunately can't really go into now, but that both John and Jesus, to them, Judea, Palestine, the Holy Land, whatever you want to call it, was only part of a much wider mission. Certainly for John the Baptist, it was only part of a much wider mission. And that Egypt is extremely important, that we believe very strongly that there is evidence, and I'll just go into a little bit here, because I know it's very tantalizing, but it's a kind of separate subject, that there's evidence that both John, Jesus, and indeed Mary Magdalene were heavily influenced by the Isis and Osiris religion of Egypt, or perhaps even the new Hellenized, Romanized version, the religion of Serapis, who was, interestingly enough, a river god, a riverine god, whose mysteries were passed on through ritual baptism. And it was a mystery school, a dying and rising god, and a mystery school connected with baptisms. And also there are clues actually in the New Testament about the Egyptian influence. For example, the Lord's Prayer, which I'll be talking about again in another context later on, but it actually comes from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Ammon, Ammon, who art in heaven, glorious be thy name, etc. When Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are heavy laden, and I will refresh you," everybody thinks that's great. You see it on posters outside churches. But in fact, if he said it, he was quoting, because it's actually carved over a temple to Isis on the banks of the Nile. There's lots and lots of that. But as I say, unfortunately and tantalizingly, I can't really go into the Egyptian stuff at the moment. So we're kind of coming to the origins of Christianity. There is an Egyptian connection again, though. John the Baptist, as I said, his Judean mission, his River Jordan mission, was only part of a much, much wider thing. And we know from other sources, from the church fathers and letters and so on, that John the Baptist had headquarters for this huge organization. He ran a huge organization. And his headquarters weren't in Jerusalem. They weren't in the Holy Land at all. His headquarters were in Alexandria in Egypt, where there was a huge Jewish colony. When I said that we believe that John and Jesus and Mary Magdalene and others were part of a new push, if you like, to take the ancient Egyptian religion to the Middle Eastern lands and Mediterranean lands, we are suggesting it was a hybrid religion with much ancient Judaism attached to it because they were ethnically Jews. They weren't Egyptians, but they came from Egypt. They came out of Egypt. We asked the question early on in our research, where did John the Baptist get baptism from? Although there are cleansing rituals connected with the Essenes, for example, there are many things about John's life and Jesus' life which ruled them out from being part of the Essene community. There are cleansing rituals in Judaism, but very minor ones, but there are. But just across the border in Egypt, they conducted twice yearly baptisms as such. I mean, they actually did them with public confessions of sins and dunking and out. And at precisely the same time as John, Jesus, and Mary Magdalene and their group were pushing their message to the Jews, that coincides exactly with the only time in history that the Egyptian religion sent missionaries beyond their borders. So I just leave you all those Egyptian connections to think about, but do bear in mind, John the Baptist's headquarters in Alexandria. But back to John the Baptist as a person. Well, as I said, he seems a strangely off-putting figure. He doesn't have any star quality. There's nothing there, remotely, in the New Testament at least, to suggest why people like Leonardo should have a thing about him, why the Mandaeans should think he's so great and that they even upheld their veneration for him against enemies. And certainly the Knights Templar did. Certainly the Knights Templar, against all sorts of accusations of heresy and blasphemy and so on. All right, let's really look at John the Baptist. We read in the New Testament, as I said, how he hails Jesus as the chosen one, falling at his feet, saying, "I'm not worthy to unlatch your sandals." And he goes on about it a bit. He does the equivalent of, I'm not worthy, I'm not worthy, to such an extent that modern scholars have picked up on this. And they've said, there's a little element of protesting too much here. It's as if the writers of the Gospels are desperate to give us the impression that there was this superior-inferior thing. Jesus in the superior position, John grovelling to him. And the reason that scholars think that they're protesting too much is that now it is known that John and Jesus and their respective disciples were in fact rivals. They were bitter rivals. And we know about John and his disciples and the enormous number of, he had thousands and thousands of disciples, and he preached to the Gentiles, and whatever it was he preached, we are told, excited people to the utmost. So it wasn't just, oh, you're a bunch of sinners, get in the river. It was actually something exciting. It was something that really got them going. In fact, this is a very interesting thing. John the Baptist is a star in the one of the few secular records of the time, Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus describes John as being a famous name, who had thousands of people flocking around, Gentiles too. And guess who isn't mentioned by Josephus at all? Jesus. We always think of Jesus as being the big one, don't we? We always think of him as being the one everybody knew about. But he's not there. Actually, I tell you, he is there. He's there because medieval monks were so embarrassed by the lack of Jesus' mention in Josephus that they actually added him. So he is there, but it's a fake. Josephus says that something different too about John the Baptist, how John the Baptist ended his days. Because we know from the Bible that there's this very unconvincing story, isn't there, of how Herod arrests John the Baptist for denouncing his marriage, his illicit marriage, and bangs him up in jail. And then there's this dancing girl, a kind of lap dancer, who is actually his stepdaughter. And we think, don't we, that her name is Salome. And we think, don't we, that we get that from the Bible. In fact, we don't, because her name isn't mentioned. We get it from Josephus. He calls her Salome. So that's how we know. When she says, I want the holy man's head on a platter, give it to me now. And so she gets it, and that's pretty much it, isn't it, for John the Baptist. In fact, he doesn't appear at all, except in the odd line when people talk about him in the New Testament. But John was incredibly important, as I say. Josephus said so. And he tells us that, in fact, John was not arrested by Herod because he criticised his marriage. He was arrested because he was so popular, so famous, that Herod arrested him as a preemptive strike because he thought there'd be an uprising against him, headed by John, or certainly by John's disciples. In fact, after John's death, Josephus also tells us, shortly before John's death, I've lost my place completely. Shortly after John was executed, Herod's army was actually defeated in battle. And the people said to Herod, well, that just shows you shouldn't have done that. It's nemesis. That's what happens. You know, God is doing this to you because you killed the holy man. You killed John. So this was the people. John was so big, and the people were agitating. They were saying, you should not have killed the Baptist. This is what it comes to if you do things like that. There's also an episode in the Gospels that confirms John's popularity was greater than Jesus. We're told that on one occasion, when Jesus was preaching to the crowds in Jerusalem, some of the chief priests came to ask him a test question in order to trick him. And they demanded that he tell them on what authority he speaks. And Jesus responds with a counter question. He asked them, where did they think John the Baptist's authority came from? Was it from heaven or was it from man? The answer being obviously implicit, that was John a holy man or not? And this catches the chief priests out. If they realise that if they say from heaven, that Jesus will say, all right, then why didn't you recognise him as a great holy man? Why didn't they accept him? But if they answer of man, then the crowd will turn against them. But notice, most people miss the point there. Jesus uses John's popularity to make his point. It's John, John, John. Even Jesus uses John, and John's name when he can. It's a very clever point. It's shrewd politically, but it's all about John the Baptist. It's not about his own popularity. And we know that John's following survived his death, not becoming necessarily, some of them already were, what we call the Mandeans. And it was no minor sect, because there's a dead giveaway in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles. Because when St. Paul, who believed that he was the first Christian missionary to go to the lands around the Mediterranean, when he arrived in Ephesus and Corinth, he was astonished to see, apparently, Christian churches already flourishing there. And he said, and these aren't his verbatim words, by the way, he said, excuse me, who are you? To the people in these churches. And they said, we're the Church of John the Baptist. And he said, all right then. In that case, you'll be pleased to see me, because I represent, it's like a Hoover salesman, sorry. He said, I represent the church of the one that John said was to come. And they said, sorry, you've lost us, mate. Don't know what you're talking about. Because John never said it. John never prophesied that there was one greater, who was Jesus, to come. John never grovelled at Jesus' feet. This is very interesting, isn't it? It changes quite a lot of things, and it goes on changing them, believe me. We've only scraped the surface. All the indications are that John's church, based in Alexandria, was much bigger than Jesus's and a threat to Jesus and his movement. It was also established well in advance of Jesus' church in foreign lands. But also, it's now known that there were John Gospels. There were Gospels written with John as the hero. And you might say, well, that's very interesting. Where are they? Good question. in the case of most of them. But don't forget that history is written by the victors. And what we're actually looking at in the New Testament is, as Steve pointed out, and I can only endorse ringingly, is actually propaganda on behalf of the Jesus Party. Where is the John literature? Where is the John propaganda, if you like? Well, amazingly, it is known that some of it was actually absorbed into the New Testament. They just changed the name of the hero. And one of my favourite examples of the John literature being used, being recycled for Jesus' lot, is the Magnificat. You know, that very, very lovely verse which the Virgin Mary is supposed to have spoken when she discovers she's pregnant with Jesus. And she says, my soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit rejoice in God my Saviour, and so on. And it's lovely. And it's particularly loved by women in the Catholic Church, for example. Yes, except that originally that particular song was spoken in the John literature by Elizabeth, John's mother. It was simply taken over by the Jesus Christians and used for their ends. And we've already seen how the Lord's Prayer has its origins in Egypt, in the Book of the Dead. But there's another thing about the Lord's Prayer. How it came about, how it was in the New Testament, was that Jesus' disciples went up to him one day and said, "Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples to pray." And it's usually assumed that Jesus invented the Lord's Prayer, and therefore it's particularly precious to Christians because it's the one thing, in a way, that we have of Jesus' own words, except they're not, as we've seen, go back to Egypt. But the latest interpretation of the situation is that Jesus taught his disciples to pray using the same words that John used to teach his disciples how to pray. In other words, the Lord in the Lord's Prayer is in fact John, not Jesus. So it's a kind of case of mistaken identity, somewhat deliberate, but there you are. There's also a perfect example of the snaffling, of the stealing of John literature. It's quite a far-reaching one, is the borrowing by the writers of the New Testament of the beginning of the John literature, in which they've turned into the beginning of the Gospel of John. By the way, it's coincidence, the name John there. The teaching, the lovely lyrical teaching, the mystical part, including "in the beginning was the Word" at the beginning of the Gospel of John, and many of the teachings given to by Jesus to his disciples, they come from John. Now, John was a Gnostic teacher. Steve said the Mandeans, his followers, Gnostics. They believe in the light. They believe in a personal knowledge of the divine. Although they have priests who will help them understand these things, they don't rely on them as one might in the church to tell you the doctrine, to tell you all about God's love for you. You feel it, you know it, you experience the light, and you understand the darkness, what it entails. John was also, of course, as Steve pointed out, associated with another infamous Gnostic. His successor was Simon Magus, the church's first hated heretic, which again removes John and his associates from the Christian story. I said he's not a Christian martyr. His successor was the first Christian heretic. And his successor also, Simon Magus, was a sex magician. He was into sacred sexuality, something akin to Tantrism of the East, which certainly removes him from the idea that being tainted, if you like, with the same brushes. John the Baptist, this great John Knox-like Puritan figure, who appoints a sex magician as his successor. It doesn't work, does it? So again, the image of John is very different. There's underlying it are suggestions that John was a much more dynamic, much more exciting person than the Jesus propaganda of the New Testament would have us believe. But what about his relationship with Jesus? Well, we've seen it's very, very unlikely indeed that he would have actually grovelled at Jesus' feet because they were bitter rivals. But I often use the analogy because we're looking at the Jesus propaganda, the New Testament. If in 2,000 years' time, all we had to understand the politics of Britain in the 1980s was a propaganda of the Tory party, and we read how Arthur Scargill knelt to Margaret Thatcher, we wouldn't know any different, would we? We'd go around talking about it, say, isn't it wonderful? With stained glass windows would, reproduce the event. This is what we have. We have the propaganda of the Jesus party telling us how the great rival of Jesus, perhaps even they were enemies, we might go that far, it's not certain, but we might, kneeling to Jesus. There's something nasty about that when you begin to get the underlying feeling and knowing about the John literature and knowing about the things that I'm going to tell you now. Because there are clues in the words of Jesus in the New Testament about what he really thought of John the Baptist. And I'll start with the mildest one. He comes out with this slightly gnomic thing. A lot of his sayings are the kind of thing you sit down and go, oh, yes, and then you think, I wonder what it means. But he says, Jesus says, no man putteth new wine in old bottles. And you might think, well, actually, this is kind of like old dogs and new tricks and things like this. But actually, it's been pointed out by theologians that in those days, wine bottles were made of animal skins. And who do we know who wore animal skins? So it's now actually, no man putteth new wine in old bottles. It's kind of like, I'm the new kid on the block. Forget the old Baptist guy. Follow me. It's actually a dig at John. But much, much worse is to come. There's actually an astonishing line or two left in the Gospels, although at first it reads like an enormous compliment. Jesus said, among them that are born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist. Mind you, he then spoils it by saying, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. So you get a compliment, and then you get, I don't know, forget it. But what did I tell you? What do the Mandeans, who hate Jesus, call Jesus? They call him son of a woman. It's a huge Middle Eastern insult. So let's look at that again. Among them that are born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist. He that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. In other words, of all complete bastards, John is the biggest. And even the lowest of the low is better than him. Ooh dear, things have changed a bit, haven't they? Yes, or son of a bitch, you say he's calling him a son of a bitch. So, all right, I think we can establish that John and Jesus' relationship was not quite as we're led to believe by Christian propaganda. But how does this fit in with the fact that Jesus' career began with baptism by John? Is his own authority tied to this act in some way? And was John the one who is to come? Well, perhaps not, I think, under the circumstances. There does appear to have been a split. Jesus does appear to have begun as one of John's disciples. Many people did, of course, as we've seen. There were thousands of them. And in fact, you can tell by the names. For example, the young John, his name, John wasn't a big name, a common name among ordinary Jews at that time. And you get Joanna, one of Jesus' followers, a woman, seconds out, was obviously named that because she had started as a follower of John. Right. So, John, Jesus, didn't like each other. Their rivals didn't like each other. Mandaeans hate Jesus. The Knights Templar spat upon and trampled upon a cross and worshipped a bearded severed head. What is going on? Was it just the fact that these guys were rivals, that all this hatred for all these years? I mean, it doesn't actually make sense, does it? I mean, just rivalry. Okay, let's look at the death of John again, shall we? Was he really killed at the whim of some stripper? I mean, even she was a stepdaughter of Herod. Josephus, as I'd said that he was actually imprisoned because he was too popular. They thought that there would be an uprising. In other words, John the Baptist was a top political prisoner. And the one thing you do not do with a top political prisoner, especially when there's thousands of his fans outside the door, is kill them. So especially if you're a Roman puppet, you have to answer to the Romans for the uprising. You certainly don't do it on the whim of some drunken lap dancer. So it doesn't work. Something else had happened. Something else had gone on. And, right, let's look at what happened immediately before John's death. Well, there's a bit that doesn't often get read out in church on Sundays in the New Testament. And that is that John, in his cell, sends a message out to Jesus and says, "Are you truly the one who is to come, or do we look for another?" Now, this is the guy who's supposed to say, you're the one, I've waited all my life for this, you're the one. And all of a sudden, he's saying, I don't know, actually. And it looks as if Jesus has heard something, John has heard something about Jesus, or he's discovered something, or, anyway, he doesn't like him. And we know he's appointed Simon Magus, of all people, as his successor. And I'm afraid I'm going to ask a fairly obvious question here. Who stood to gain by John's death? Not Herod, not even Salome, whatever her name was really, not even Salome, and certainly not the Romans. So who stood to gain? Well, what happened immediately after John's death? Jesus took over his following. Now, remember what the Mandeans called Jesus, among other things. They called him usurper of the cults, usurper of John's following. They called him the lying Messiah, practicing sorcery and treachery. All right, who stood to gain by John's death? And we know that Jesus had a disciple called Salome. It was a common enough name, but we do know that wherever she appeared in the New Testament, except at the very end when she appears by the cross with the other women, her name has been excised by the writers of the Gospels. It appeared originally and was taken out as if there was something suspicious about it. They don't want us to know that there was a Salome involved with Jesus. Okay, I'll just leave that lying there. What I want to say now is, okay, there are two things here. There's the Christ of faith, and there's the Jesus of history. And there may be some people sitting in the audience who are thinking, this is blasphemy, this is appalling, can she really be suggesting what I think she's suggesting? Even if there were all these people, generations of Templars or whatever, have believed this is awful because Jesus is the Christ, he's God, and I believe that. There's nothing I can say or do to change that. Faith is immovable, and that's your personal, intimate relationship with Christ. But I'm talking about Jesus of history, and I don't think he was a very nice man. And I think he had a hand in John the Baptist's death, if only to do a "who will rid me of this turbulent priest" number, and maybe his followers had a hand in it. But this is a big story. This is why the Templars and others, the Johannites, had to keep it down. They had to keep it secret. This is why they used symbols. This is why they were accused of blasphemy in the worshipping of John the Baptist. This is why they hate Jesus. And this is why, after all this time, as we enter a new millennium, it's time to air these things and discuss them. And you never know, it might be right. And if it is right, as we firmly believe it is, everything changes. Thank you.
I do the best. Of course, the point that Lynn was making toward the end of that is very, very important. The difference between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith. As Christians, or those of us who might have ticked boxes saying C of E at some time in our lives, which I think is more a badge than anything else, or as members of the Jewish faith, or as members of the Muslim faith, the three great faiths that come from the same root, I don't think it particularly matters whether, and I won't mention Muhammad, otherwise I'll have a fatwa on me, whether any of the priests